Good evening and welcome to our Friday night Bible study. We're glad you could join us, and looks like everything's going more or less like it's supposed to. And I feel like when you're retired, small things become big accomplishments. I feel like I kind of accomplished something this week because I finally finished recoating the deck out back of our house. I'd gotten about half of it done a couple of weeks ago, so I finished that part, and I even did the top two steps. Now there's a door out onto the deck from the house, kind of the back door of the house. And then there are steps up to the deck from the yard, very close to where the door is. Those steps have not been replaced. Several years ago, I replaced all the decking on the floor of the main deck itself. I had not been keeping it up. I hadn't been recoating it. So over time, the wood got in worse and worse and worse condition, and I finally decided I've got to replace all that. So I went to the local lumber yard and measured everything, calculated what I need, ordered the lumber I needed. They brought their delivery truck over, delivered it to my yard, and I took a week's vacation. And it was 2 or 3 days effort on my part, not working all day, obviously, to get all those boards pulled up and thrown out and replaced. They had been held down with nails. I put them in with screws, although they didn't hold as well as I had been hoping. But they're there, they're screwed down, and at least some of the screws are holding. So it's in pretty decent shape. And I have recoated it twice since that point. The last time being just a few days ago this week. Now, I mentioned the steps up to it. There are 5 steps leading up to that deck from the lawn, and I had never done anything with them. And they weren't in as bad shape because they were 2-inch thick boards instead of 1-inch thick boards like the deck itself was. But they were looking pretty grody. They hadn't been recoated as long as we'd had the house. So I did the top 2 of them on Wednesday when I did the deck. Still had a little coating left over. So Thursday I went out and I did the other 3 steps. And then I did a few other parts of it until I used up all the coating that I had. So I was able to flip the can in the trash. So that was sort of an accomplishment for the week. There was some news during the week, and I'm going to show you where it happened, as well as tell you about it. In fact, right now what I'm doing is I'm calling up Google Earth, which is taking its time, probably because we're streaming, so that uses up some of my bandwidth. And but let's go ahead and look at it here. I've got it up now. Now, this didn't happen in the United States. It happened in Portugal. And maybe you heard about it. There was a streetcar, funical, I think is what they call it there, accident in Lisbon, Portugal. Lisbon is the capital of Portugal. And it's right here along this big bay off the Atlantic Ocean. And you can see the name, well, I don't know, from in your view, you may not be able to see the name Lisbon, but that's Lisbon, the main area right there where I'm running the cursor around. Now, if you zoom in, you'll see this rather large thoroughfare that's pretty visible coming from the palace of the park of Eduardo the Seventh, I guess. And this is called Avenue, well, I won't try and pronounce it in Portuguese because I don't know Portuguese, but essentially it's Freedom Avenue. And down at this end, right here where the trees end and the concrete begins, you can see off to the side here kind of a street light that comes up and then curves and then goes up the hill, and it goes up to here. And this is called, and yes, it does here, you can't read it probably on your screen, but it says Elevador da Gloria. And that is, well, let's go into Street View here, and you'll be able to see the streetcar itself. One, there are two. This picture will show you one. We're looking in the wrong direction here. There it is, the streetcar. Now you'll see that that is in fact going up a hill, and if you look at the streetcar, you'll see that it's specially built with a carriage that matches the tilt of the earth and the tilt of the rails that it rides on, while the cabin of the car itself is level. And you can see there well, hopefully you can see there the view, the apparatus that attaches it to the electricity so that it can work its way up the hill and back down. And in fact, having looked at it from this end, let's go look at the other end. There are two tracks there, but they overlap each other so that you can't run both cars at the bottom next to each other. At the top, however, you can. I'm going to hope that it doesn't get me, because it wants to give me, yeah, it did that. You go into the street picture and it wants to give you somebody's uploaded picture. And yeah, that's from, I think it was from about 2014. That's an older picture. So let's do this. Let's go in there and we'll reset the tilt and compass, and then we'll zoom in a little bit closer, and we'll try that again. Hopefully I'll get what I'm looking for here. No, it did this to me the other day. This is another individual picture. I'm not wanting it. This is from August of 2015. Again, you can see that they painted the car up with graffiti, and the company that runs it has since redone that. Let's get out. I may have to drop in at a different place so I can get on the street view and then work my way up so you can see it. Yeah, that should do. This is from a year and a couple of months ago, and you can see how there's two sets of tracks here. And come on. There again, you can see the design of the car itself. And these, I don't know about these particular cars, but this track, it's less than a kilometer long. This track is from the late 18th century, or late 19th century. From the 1880s is when they started this. The cars are probably newer, but even they are a little bit older. And you can see there the name of the company that runs these nowadays. Now, I'm going to jump back out here because I found out by trying it's very hard to follow the track down the hill in street view like that. So we're going to do this. Now you see here as you get near the bottom of the hill that the tracks curve and go around the right and towards the bottom. And what happened this week was that one of the cars on its way down apparently lost control and may have been at a relatively high rate of speed, couldn't make the curve, and the car jumped off the track and crashed into the building you can see right here. And it was not a happy accident. The last I read, I forgot to look it up, more recently, 16 people were confirmed dead. Some of them were tourists. So it was a tourist. This is kind of a tourist attraction kind of a thing. So that's just something that we ran across this week. You may have also seen in the news that our president has issued an executive order renaming the Department of Defense back to what it was in the mid 20th century, the War Department. So, just of interest if you're interested. Anyway, let's get something else up here that we're supposed to be doing and be prepared. Last week on our Bible study, we almost finished 2 Chronicles. we got to the end of our time and we had one chapter left to read, and I wanted to take a little bit of time with that, not a lot, but I didn't want to overrun too much, so we just skipped that. So we'll read this last chapter before we get into the book of Ezra. And let's bow our heads before we begin. Our Father in heaven, we thank you that we have another week to seek to know you better and to seek to emulate your character in our own relationships with others. As we open the written word this evening, we want it to lead us to the living word, to your Son, Jesus Christ, who is the perfect image of you in character. And we want to see that. We want to be awed and amazed by it. And we want that to turn into a transformation of our own characters so that we reflect that image as we were designed to. And we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. So, we have our Bible Gateway up. Bible Gateway, by the way, is a product of Zondervan Corporation out of Grand Rapids. They're a Dutch Reformed organization. That's the predominant denomination in that part of Michigan. And this is a part of history that when we read it out of 2 Kings, we noted the pattern. 3 months, 11 years, 3 months, 11 years. So you have about 22 and a half years from the death of Josiah to the final removal of all but the poorest people from Judah and Jerusalem. And those few got scared and fled to Egypt. We've covered that story. We'll get into that in some detail when we read the book of Jeremiah, because the book of Jeremiah gives some of this history in considerable detail, as well as the history of what happened after that final defeat of the last king, Zedekiah. It says, "Then the people of the land took Josiah's son Jehoahaz and made him the next king in Jerusalem." This is right after Josiah's death. Recall that he went out and picked a fight with Pharaoh Necho, who didn't want to fight him, was upset that he had to fight him because he was going to help the king of Assyria against the Babylonians or the Chaldeans. And so imagine this now. He's gone to help the king of Assyria. The two together have taken on the king of Babylon and have essentially had their hinder portions handed to them on a platter by the king of Babylon. So now they're in a sour mood as they go back to Egypt. And they remember what Josiah did 3 months earlier. So when they get in Jerusalem, well, let's read about it here. Jehoahaz was 23 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 3 months. Then he was deposed by the king of Egypt, who demanded that Judah pay 7,500 pounds of silver and 75 pounds of gold as tribute. Sounds expensive, but compared to some of the other demands that had been made of the country, it wasn't a very oppressive demand. And that then it says the king of Egypt then installed Eliakim, the brother of Jehoahaz, as the next king of Judah and Jerusalem. And he changed Eliakim's name to Jehoiakim. Then Necho took Jehoahaz to Egypt as prisoner. Now, Eliakim, Jehoiakim are very similar. They have the same ending. And you may recognize the El in Eliakim as a Hebrew designation of God. El-Akim, Eliakim. Now, Jehoiakim, also a name for divinity. So he just changed the name essentially to indicate that he was in charge. I'm controlling things. You're my vassal. You jump when I say jump, and you ask how high on the way up, that kind of thing. It says, then Necho took Jehoahaz to Egypt as a prisoner. Jehoiakim was 25 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 11 years. He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. Now, we have noted in the past how these books of Chronicles seem to try to whitewash the record of the kings of Judah, even mentioning, as the books of Kings did not, the repentance of Manasseh. In this case, however, these four kings, these books take a very negative view, and essentially all they say is he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord his God. Just like it says this about Jehoiakim here. It doesn't say anything about Jehoahaz. He only had 3 months, and apparently that wasn't enough time for him to establish any record as to how he was going to relate to the God of Israel. But Jehoiakim, it says, who used to be Eliakim, and notice he was older. Jehoahaz was 23, and only 3 months later his brother takes over and he's 25. So obviously Eliakim, now Jehoiakim, was the older of these sons. Then King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came to Jerusalem and captured it, and he bound Jehoiakim in bronze chains and led him away to Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar also took some of the treasures from the temple of the Lord, and he placed them in his palace in Babylon. The rest of the events in Jehoiakim's reign, including all the evil things he did and everything found against him, are recorded in the book of the kings of Israel and Judah. Then his son Jehoiakim became the next king. Now, this doesn't give us a lot of detail. We know that about 3 years into Jehoiakim's reign, Nebuchadnezzar did come. He made Jehoiakim his vassal, although Jehoiakim would eventually rebel. And we believe, in fact, we know for certain, based on the account of Daniel, that was when Daniel was taken captive. It may also have been, although we don't have an exact record of it, when Ezekiel was taken captive from Judah into Babylon. All of Ezekiel's writing is done from Babylon. But let me read the first verses of Daniel here. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasure house of his God. And then it goes on to talk about the provisions made for Daniel and his friends. And we know how that story will go on. We can read that later when we get to that book. So this happened during the reign of Jehoiakim. He reigned for 11 years, so there were about 9 years left after Nebuchadnezzar first came to Jerusalem and captured it. And then Jehoiakim becomes king. He's 18 when he becomes king. He reigned in Jerusalem 3 months and 10 days. Jehoiakim did what was evil in the Lord's sight. I don't know if the books of Kings make any reference to what Jehoiakim did. Again, probably because there wasn't much time for him to establish any kind of a record. In the spring of the year, King Nebuchadnezzar took Jehoiakim to Babylon. Many treasures from the temple of the Lord were also taken to Babylon at that time. So this is the second time now that Nebuchadnezzar has come. Jehoiakim had rebelled against him and apparently tied up with other things. Nebuchadnezzar hadn't really done much about it, but now that he's dead, Jehoiakim becomes king, and Nebuchadnezzar comes and takes him out, takes him captive to Babylon. Now, it says here that Jehoiakim himself was taken in bronze chains and led away to Babylon. Um, what did the Book of Kings say about that? I thought they said he died, but I might be wrong. Jehoiakim rested with his fathers, and Jehoiakim his son succeeded him as king. Now, if he's 25 when he becomes king, he reigns 11 years, that's only 36. That's an early death. It may have been, we don't get enough detailed information there. It may have been aided a little bit. So, Jehoiakim just 3 months and 10 days, and then Nebuchadnezzar comes and takes him off captive, and Nebuchadnezzar installed Jehoiakim's uncle, Zedekiah, as the next king in Judah and Jerusalem. Now, this book doesn't tell us, but again, Nebuchadnezzar, like Necho before him, changed the name of the person he set in charge of Judah at Jerusalem, because Zedekiah's name was originally Mattaniah, and Nebuchadnezzar had it changed to Zedekiah and installed him as king. Zedekiah was 21 years old when he became king, so he was quite a bit younger than the other two brothers who had served as king after the death of his father Josiah. He reigned in Jerusalem 11 years, but Zedekiah did what was evil in the sight of the Lord his God, and refused to humble himself when the prophet Jeremiah spoke to him directly from the Lord. He also rebelled against King Nebuchadnezzar, even though he had taken an oath of loyalty in God's name. Zedekiah was a hard and stubborn man, refusing to turn to the Lord, the God of Israel. Likewise, all the leaders of the priests and the people became more and more unfaithful. They followed all the pagan practices of the surrounding nations, desecrating the temple of the Lord that had been consecrated in Jerusalem. Okay, that's possible. The Lord, the God of their ancestors, repeatedly sent his prophets to warn them, for he had compassion on his people and his temple. But the people mocked these messengers of God and despised their words. We'll get some detail about that in the book of Jeremiah when we get that far. They scoffed at the prophets until the Lord's anger could no longer be restrained and nothing could be done. And of course, we have to understand that how the Lord's anger works, how his wrath works. He lets us have what we are so stubbornly insisting on having, even though it's not good for us. So the Lord brought the king of Babylon against them. The Babylonians killed Judah's young men, even chasing after them into the temple. They had no pity on the people, killing both young men and young women, the old and the infirm. God handed all of them over to Nebuchadnezzar. The king took home to Babylon all the articles, large and small, used in the temple of God, and the treasures from both the Lord's temple and from the palace of the king and his officials. Then his army burned the temple of God, tore down the walls of Jerusalem, burned all the palaces, and completely destroyed everything of value. The few who survived were taken as exiles to Babylon, and they became servants to the king and his sons until the kingdom of Persia came to power. Now we've crossed over a bunch of footnotes there. Jehoahaz is a variant spelling of Jehoahaz. The Hebrew 100 talents and 1 talent. The word temple there. That's interesting. 36:9. What's that about? Oh, 9 instead of 18. Well, yeah, 9. Well, I mean, his dad was 36 at the time. So for him to be 18, dad would have been 18 when he was born. That's not a particular thing. But apparently, most Hebrew manuscripts read 8. he was as young as his grandfather Josiah when he became king, if that's the case. However, because the one Hebrew manuscripts, some Greek manuscripts, and the Syriac version, and see also 2 Kings 24:8, so hard to say. I'm going to guess that that's an error that got into most Hebrew manuscripts because of an error in the original autograph of these things, that somehow whoever wrote this down didn't get it right and got 8 instead of 18. Hebrew at the turn of the year, that would be in the spring. The first day of this year in the ancient Hebrew lunar calendar was April 13, 597 BC. Not sure how they know all that. Okay. So, at any rate, as we read, Zedekiah was 21 when he became king. He reigned in Jerusalem 11 years, but Zedekiah did what was evil in the sight of the Lord his God, and he refused to humble himself, and we've read all that before. So we're ready to read here. And we've read also about what the king of Babylon did, namely Nebuchadnezzar, in destroying Jerusalem and tearing everything down. Nebuchadnezzar had added up to here with the rebellious Jews, and he said, if that's going to how they're going to treat me, we're just going to make sure that they don't have anything to consider home to make problems over. The few who survived were taken as exiles to Babylon, and they became servants to the king and his sons until the kingdom of Persia came to power. Now, this book doesn't mention those left behind, although Nebuchadnezzar did leave some behind, and he assigned Gedaliah to be a governor over them. And we read part of that story back in Kings because it tells it. And we'll read it again in the book of Jeremiah. So the message of the Lord spoken through Jeremiah was fulfilled. The land finally enjoyed its Sabbath rest, lying desolate until the 70 years were fulfilled, just as the prophet had said. Now this is an interesting reference here, the land enjoying its Sabbath rest. Recall back in the books of Moses, and we didn't go over those in great detail, but I think we did mention this provision. The Jews were supposed to till the land for 6 years, and then in the 7th year let the land rest, eating only what grew volunteer. They were not to till the soil or to do any work on it. Whatever came up of its own accord, they could eat that. The surplus from previous years was available to them, but they were not to work the land. Well, some believe that the Israelites very quickly abandoned this practice and did not give the land its Sabbath rest every 7th year. Now, if you read this 70 years and you take that as each of those 70 years as one of the Sabbath years, then that's 1 year for every 7. 7 times 70 is 480. We're covering about 490 years of Sabbaths, and 490 takes us back to approximately the time of Saul and David. So apparently when they chose kings is when they quit doing this Sabbath rest thing. Who knows? This is just what these writers viewed as an interesting and significant aspect to the 70 years that the land was abandoned with no people to work it until later. And now we read the later in verse 22. Now I want you to pay close attention. This is just 2 verses. But pay close attention to this because we're going to read the same thing in the next chapter, which will be a different book. In the 1st year of King Cyrus of Persia, the Lord fulfilled the prophecy he had given through Jeremiah. Actually, Cyrus is mentioned in the book of Isaiah, but anyway. He stirred the heart of Cyrus to put this proclamation in writing and to send it throughout his kingdom. This is what King Cyrus of Persia says. Yahweh, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth. He has appointed me to build him a temple at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Any of you who are his people may go there for this task, and may the Lord your God be with you. Now, some people suggest, and this is very possible, that Daniel was still alive under Darius and Cyrus, these kings of Persia. Darius was actually just the general who took Babylon, and he kind of became king of Babylon since he took the city. But Cyrus was king of all Persia. At least that's the way I understand it. But at any rate, in his position, as he was able to transition from the Babylonian kingdom into the Persian kingdom, demonstrating his integrity and the trust and honor with which he was held, that he was, not killed by the Persians, but instead utilized as a resource, that he may have had opportunity to discuss things with Cyrus and to show him the scrolls of the prophet Isaiah where Cyrus is mentioned. And that may have had an influence on Cyrus to issue this decree. Now let's go on to the first chapter of Ezra. In the first year of King Cyrus of Persia, the Lord fulfilled the prophecy he had given through Jeremiah. He stirred the heart of Cyrus to put this proclamation in writing and to send it throughout his kingdom. This is what King Cyrus of Persia says. The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth. He has appointed me to build him a temple at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Any of you who are his people may go to Jerusalem in Judah to rebuild this temple of the Lord, the God of Israel, who lives in Jerusalem, and may your God be with you. Wherever this Jewish remnant is found, let their neighbors contribute toward their expenses by giving them silver and gold, supplies for the journey, and livestock, as well as a voluntary offering for the temple of God in Jerusalem. Now, clearly, this reference here goes a little bit further, and the last sentence is altered a little bit, but otherwise, it is word for word what we just read at the end of 2 Chronicles, which is why most scholars believe that those who put the history of Judah to writing in the books of Chronicles are the same ones who prepared the book of Ezra. Then God stirred the hearts of the priests and Levites and the leaders of the tribes of Judah and Benjamin to go to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple of the Lord. And all their neighbors assisted by giving them articles of silver and gold, supplies for the journey, and livestock. They gave them many valuable gifts in addition to all the voluntary offerings. King Cyrus himself brought out articles that King Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the Lord's temple in Jerusalem and had placed in the temple of his own gods. Cyrus directed Mithridath, the treasurer of Persia, to count these items and present them to Sheshbazzar, the leader of the exiles returning to Judah. This is a list of the items that were returned: 30 gold basins, 1,000 silver basins, 29 silver incense burners, 30 gold bowls, 410 silver bowls, and 1,000 other items. In all, there were 5,400 articles of gold and silver. Sheshbazzar brought all of these along when the exiles went from Babylon to Jerusalem. Now, there are a few footnotes to this short first chapter. The first year of Cyrus' reign over Babylon was, 538 BC. The other one says, see Jeremiah. Sheshbazzar, the prince of Judah, and the meaning of this Hebrew word is uncertain. In verse 9, the exiles returning to Judah. Oh, the incense burners. Okay, yeah. Okay. Now, what's not clear, Sheshbazzar does not show up in the list of the genealogy of Jesus, although Shealtiel is. And I'm going to look at Matthew first and see how Matthew gives it, the sequence he gives it. Jeconiah, which was another name for Jehoiakim, was the father of Shealtiel. Shealtiel, the father of Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel is the one mentioned in Haggai and Zechariah. Zerubbabel, the father of Abiud, and so on. So maybe Shealtiel and this Sheshbazzar are the same person. Possibly. We know that Zerubbabel was considered the prince of Judah. He wasn't considered the king because Cyrus and his successors retained that designation. They never let Judah have full sovereignty even after they let the exiles return. Ezra chapter 2. Here's a list of the Jewish exiles of the provinces who returned from their captivity. King Nebuchadnezzar had deported them to Babylon, but now they've returned to Jerusalem and the other towns in Judah where they originally lived. Their leaders were Zerubbabel, Jeshua, Nehemiah, Sariah, Realiah, Mordecai, Bilshan, Mispar, Bigvai, Rehum, and Baanah. This is the number of men of Israel who returned from exile, and it names the families and gives numbers there. We won't go through all that. The family of Ater, descendants of Hezekiah, interesting. The family of Jediah through the line of Jeshua. And then the Levites who returned. The descendants of the following temple servants returned from exile. The descendants of these servants of King Solomon returned from exile. In all, the temple servants and the descendants of Solomon's servants numbered 392. Another group returned at this time from the towns of Tel Melah, Tel Harsha, Kerub, Adon, and Immer. However, they could not prove that they or their families were descendants of Israel. This group included the families of Deliah, Tobiah, and Dakota, a total of 652 people. 3 families of priests also returned. This Barzillai had married a woman who was a descendant of Barzillai of Gilead and had taken her family name. They searched for their names in the genealogical records, but they were not found, so they were disqualified from serving as priests. You see here the importance that genealogy has already taken on amongst the exiles who returned to Judah. The governor told them not to eat the priest's share of food from the sacrifices until a priest could consult the Lord about the matter by using the Urim and Thummim, the sacred lots. So a total of 42,360 people returned to Judah, in addition to 7,337 servants, 200 singers, both men and women. They took with them 736 horses, 245 mules, 435 camels, and 6,720 donkeys. When they arrived at the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem, some of the family leaders made voluntary offerings toward the rebuilding of God's temple on its original site, and each leader gave as much as he could. The total of their gifts came to 61,000 gold coins, 6,250 pounds of silver, and 100 robes for the priests. So the priests, the Levites, the singers, the gatekeepers, the temple servants, and some of the common people settled in villages near Jerusalem. The rest of the people returned to their own towns throughout Israel. The altar is rebuilt. In early autumn, footnote A, the Hebrew in the seventh month. The year is not specified, so it may have been during Cyrus's first year, 538 BC, or the second year, 537 BC. Recall that the years BC go backwards as you progress through time, because they're backwards. It's a convention that we've applied to them. It's not what they were at the time. The seventh month of the ancient Hebrew lunar calendar occurred within the months of September or October, and October and November of that particular year. Okay, so then Jeshua, son of Jehozadak, joined his fellow priests and Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, with his family in rebuilding the altar of the God of Israel. They wanted to sacrifice burnt offerings on it, as instructed in the law of Moses, the man of God. Even though the people were afraid of the local residents, they rebuilt the altar at its old site. Then they began to sacrifice burnt offerings on the altar to the Lord each morning and evening. They celebrated the festival of shelters as prescribed in the law, sacrificing the number of burnt offerings specified for each day of the festival. They also offered the regular burnt offerings and the offerings required for the new moon celebrations and the annual festivals as prescribed by Yahweh. The people also gave voluntary offerings to Yahweh. 15 days before the festival of the shelters began, the priests had begun to sacrifice burnt offerings to the Lord. This was even before they had started to lay the foundation of the Lord's temple. Then the people hired masons and carpenters and bought cedar logs from the people of Tyre and Sidon, paying them with food, wine, and olive oil. The logs were brought down from the Lebanon mountains and floated along the coast of the Mediterranean Sea to Joppa, for King Cyrus had given permission for this. The construction of the temple of God began in mid-spring during the second year after they arrived in Jerusalem. The workforce was made up of everyone who had returned from exile, including Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, Jeshua, son of Jehozadak, and his fellow priests, and all the Levites. The Levites, who were 20 years old or older, were put in charge of rebuilding the Lord's temple. The workers at the temple of God were supervised by Yeshua with his sons and relatives, and Kadmiel and his sons, all descendants of Hodaviah. They were helped in this task by the Levites of the family of Henadad. When the builders completed the foundation of the Lord's temple, the priests put on their robes and took their places to blow their trumpets, and the Levites, descendants of Asaph, clashed their cymbals to praise the Lord, just as King David had prescribed. With praise and thanks they sang this song to the Lord. He is so good. His faithful love for Israel endures forever. Then all the people gave a great shout, praising the Lord, because the foundation of the Lord's temple had been laid. But many of the older priests, and we did a sermon about 3 weeks back on the book of Haggai, and these people were referenced. Many of the older priests, Levites, and other leaders who had seen the first temple wept aloud when they saw the new temple's foundation. The others, however, were shouting for joy. The joyful shouting and weeping mingled together in a loud noise that could be heard far in the distance. Chapter 4. Now, this is the one that we referenced briefly in our sermon on the book of Haggai. And it gives some names that are a little bit confusing when you know the history of the kings of Persia. But let's read through it, then we can talk about it. The enemies of Judah and Benjamin heard that the exiles were rebuilding a temple to the Lord, the God of Israel. So they approached Zerubbabel and the other leaders and said, "Let us build with you, for we worship your God just as you do. And we have sacrificed him ever since King Esarhaddon of Assyria brought us here." Now, opinion varies on exactly who these people were. And the designation of them as enemies is something put here by the writer of this book, reflecting the view of whoever wrote this book, be it Ezra or somebody associated with him. And so some people think that these are the foreigners who were resettled in Israel in the days of Hezekiah. And you may recall that they were suffering attacks from wild animals. And somebody told the king of Assyria that, well, it's because they don't know what the God of the land requires. Get a priest to show them how to worship. So then they worshiped Yahweh according to the instructions of the Israelite priest that got sent back, whose information may have been a little bit muddled given the condition of the northern kingdom. But they also continued the worship of their own gods, the kind of, equal opportunity worshipers, you might say. Is that who these people are? Or are these people of Israel who, during the time of King Esarhaddon, were brought back into the land of Israel? I can't tell you for sure. But listen to what happens. But Zerubbabel, Yeshua, and the other leaders of Israel replied, "You may have no part in this work. We alone will build the temple of the Lord, the God of Israel, just as King Cyrus of Persia commanded us." Now, the thing that I wonder here is, it doesn't say that they consulted with God before they made this decision. It just says they made this decision. Was this justified? Were these people truly enemies trying to make trouble for Israel? And was the decision of Zerubbabel and Yeshua to exclude them warranted? Or, this is just a possibility, I won't say it's absolutely true, did they create enemies by brushing off people that wanted to be part of the work? No, you can't do it. And so, well, now they're enemies. So they've been snubbed, they've been put off, they've been disrespected. Then the local residents tried to discourage and frighten the people of Judah to keep them from their work. They bribed agents to work against them and to frustrate their plans. This went on during the entire reign of King Cyrus of Persia and lasted until King Darius of Persia took the throne. Now, this next phrase is interesting. Years later, when Xerxes began his reign, the enemies of Judah wrote a letter of accusation against the people of Judah and Jerusalem. Now, this is apparently, this may be after the time of Haggai and Zechariah that we covered 3 weeks back in our sermon presentation. Years later, when Xerxes began his reign, the enemies of Judah wrote a letter of accusation. We've read that. Even later, during the reign of King Artaxerxes of Persia, the enemies of Judah, led by Bishlam, Mithridath, and Tabeel, sent a letter to Artaxerxes in the Aramaic language, and it was translated for the king. Rehum the governor and Shimshai, the court secretary, wrote the letter, telling King Artaxerxes about the situation in Jerusalem. They greeted the king for all their callings, the judges and local leaders, the people of Tarpal, the Persians, the Babylonians, the people of Erech and Susa, that is Elam. They also sent greetings from the rest of the people, whom the great and noble Ashurbanipal had deported and relocated in Samaria and throughout the neighboring lands of the province west of the Euphrates River. This is a copy of their letter. To King Artaxerxes, from your loyal subjects in the province west of the Euphrates River. The king should know that the Jews who came here to Jerusalem from Babylon are rebuilding this rebellious and evil city. Well, we know from the history of the Jews from Hezekiah onward that in fact the Jews were exceptionally evil and rebellious. They would rebel against the king who had made them a vassal and try to become separate and independent and sovereign again, and they got themselves into trouble, and in sometimes very painful trouble, as a result of this stubbornness, essentially. So there is good reason for these, and there is historical precedent for them to write what they are telling them, that Jerusalem is a rebellious and evil city. They've already laid the foundation and will soon finish its walls. And the king should know that if this city is rebuilt and its walls are completed, it will be much to your disadvantage, for the Jews will then refuse to pay their tribute, customs, and tolls to you. Again, this is not without historical precedent. Yes, the Jews had, in times past, rebelled against the kings who controlled them and quit sending their tribute, wanting to be sovereign and independent again. Since we are your loyal subjects and do not want to see the king dishonored in this way, we have sent the king this information. We suggest that a search be made in your ancestors' records, where you will discover what a rebellious city this has been in the past. In fact, it was destroyed because of its long and troublesome history of revolt against the kings and countries who controlled it. We declare to the king that if this city is rebuilt and its walls are completed, the province west of the Euphrates River will be lost to you. Well, maybe not. Maybe these Jews had recognized which side of their bread was buttered, and may have been a little bit more submissive. But history suggested that what these people are saying is true, that they would try to take over the territory west of the Euphrates and make it their own and try to be independent of the king of Persia. Then King Artaxerxes sent this reply to Rehum the governor, Shimshai the court secretary, and their colleagues living in Samaria and throughout the province west of the Euphrates River. Greetings. The letter you sent has been translated and read to me. I ordered a search of the records and have found that Jerusalem has indeed been a hotbed of insurrection against many kings. In fact, rebellion and revolt are normal there. Powerful kings have ruled over Jerusalem and the entire province west of the Euphrates River, receiving tribute, customs, and tolls. Therefore, issue orders to have these men stop their work. That city must not be rebuilt except at my express command. Be diligent and don't neglect this matter, for we must not permit the situation to harm the king's interests. When this letter from King Artaxerxes was read to Rehum, Shimshai, and their colleagues, they hurried to Jerusalem. Then, with a show of strength, they forced the Jews to stop building. So, the work on the temple of God in Jerusalem had stopped, and it remained at a standstill until the second year of the reign of King Darius of Persia. Now, the question is whether verses 6 through 22 or 23 here are chronological with the rest of the chapter, or if in fact it's reviewing things that happened farther ahead into the future, and that this work of the temple of God in Jerusalem stopped because of the local opposition, not because of the letters to Artaxerxes. I can't tell you for sure. I mean, the reference to both Xerxes and Artaxerxes suggests that that is after the reign of King Darius of Persia. Darius, here it says, reigned 521 to 46 BC. The Hebrew is Ahasuerus, another name for Xerxes, and then Artaxerxes reigned, and those are all afterwards. So this version, at least, seems to say the second year of Darius' reign was 520 BC. The narrative started in 4:1 through 5, is resumed at verse 24. So that's their take, that in fact those verses 6 through 23 are just interjected and they're out of Chronicles sequence with the rest of it. And it makes sense if you do it that way, and you compare it to because the Ahasuerus or Xerxes and Artaxerxes, those were they had their reigns after Darius, as you can see in the dates given here. At that time, the prophets Haggai and Zechariah, son of Iddo, prophesied to the Jews in Jerusalem, in Judah and Jerusalem. They prophesied in the name of the God of Israel, who was over them. Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, and Jeshua, son of Jehozadak, responded by starting again to rebuild the temple of God in Jerusalem. And the prophets of God were with them and helped them. But Tatnai, governor of the province west of the Euphrates River, and Shethar-Bozenai and their colleagues soon arrived in Jerusalem and asked, "Who gave you permission to rebuild this temple and restore this structure?" They also asked for the names of all the men working on the temple. But because their God was watching over them, the leaders of the Jews were not prevented from building until a report was sent to Darius, and he returned his decision. This is a copy of the letter that Tatnai, the governor, Shethar-Bozenai, and the other officials of the province west of the Euphrates River sent to King Darius. To King Darius, greetings. The king should know that we went to the construction site of the temple of the great God of the province of Judah. It is being rebuilt with specially prepared stones, and timber is being laid in its walls. The work is going forward with great energy and success. We asked the leaders who gave you permission to rebuild this temple and restore this structure, and we demanded their names so that we could tell you who the leaders were. This was their answer. We are the servants of the God of heaven and earth, and we are rebuilding the temple that was built here many years ago by a great king of Israel. But because our ancestors angered the God of heaven, he abandoned them to King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, or Chaldea, who destroyed this temple and exiled the people to Babylonia. However, King Cyrus of Babylon, or Persia, during the first year of his reign, issued a decree that the temple of God should be rebuilt. King Cyrus returned the gold and silver cups that Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple of God in Jerusalem and had placed in the temple of Babylon. These cups were taken from that temple and presented to a man named Sheshbazzar, whom King Cyrus appointed as governor of Judah. The king instructed him to return the cups to their place in Jerusalem and to rebuild the temple of God there on its original site. So this Sheshbazzar came and laid the foundations of the temple of God in Jerusalem. The people have been working on it ever since, though it is not yet completed. Therefore, if it pleases the king, we request that a search be made in the royal archives of Babylon to discover whether King Cyrus ever issued a decree to rebuild God's temple in Jerusalem, and then let the king send us his decision in this matter. So, the opponents are there, and would they have been opponents if they had been allowed to help? Well, we don't know. Maybe they would have. So maybe there wasn't any escape from all this opposition. At any rate, chapter 6. So King Darius issued orders that a search be made in the Babylonian archives, which were stored in the treasury, but it was at the fortress of Ecbatana in the province of Media that a scroll was found. This is what it said. Memorandum. In the first year of King Cyrus's reign, a decree was sent out concerning the temple of God at Jerusalem. Let the temple be rebuilt on the site where Jews used to offer their sacrifices, using the original foundations. Its height will be 90 feet, and its width will be 90 feet. Every 3 layers of specially prepared stones will be topped by a layer of timber. All expenses will be paid by the royal treasury. Furthermore, the gold and silver cups which were taken to Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar from the temple of God in Jerusalem must be returned to Jerusalem and put back where they belong. Let them be taken back to the temple of God. So that's what Darius found. So here's the message he sent back. Now, therefore, Tatnai, governor of the province west of the Euphrates River, and Shethar-Bozenai and your colleagues and other officials west of the Euphrates River, stay away from there. Do not disturb the construction of the temple of God. Let it be rebuilt on its original site, and do not hinder the governor of Judah and the elders of the Jews in their work. Moreover, I hereby decree that you are to help these elders of the Jews as they rebuild this temple of God. You must pay the full construction costs without delay from my taxes collected in the province west of the Euphrates River, so that the work will not be interrupted. Give the priests in Jerusalem whatever is needed in the way of young bulls, rams, and male lambs for the burnt offerings presented to the God of heaven. And without fail, provide them with as much wheat, salt, wine, and olive oil as they need each day. Then they will be able to offer acceptable sacrifices to the God of heaven and pray for the welfare of the king and his sons. Now, if I had to guess, I would say that this is the king trying to cover all his bases. I'm not sure that he really believes that the God of the Jews is in fact the creator of the world. But, so as not to incur a potential God's wrath, he says, let's see to it that he's served according to the dictates that he's sent through his prophets. Let's do that so that we don't incur his wrath. Let's do these things because we want to cover all our bases, so to speak. Those who violate this decree in any way will have a beam pulled from their house. Then they will be lifted up and impaled on it, and their house will be reduced to a pile of rubble. Pretty extreme punishment, right? May the God who has chosen the city of Jerusalem as the place to honor his name destroy any king or nation that violates this command and destroys this temple. I, Darius, have issued this decree. Let it be obeyed with all diligence. Tatanai, governor of the province west of the Euphrates River, and Shethar-bozenai and their colleagues complied at once with the command of King Darius. So the Jewish elders continued their work, and they were greatly encouraged by the preaching of the prophets Haggai and Zechariah, son of Iddo. The temple was finally finished, as had been commanded by the God of Israel and decreed by Cyrus, Darius, and Artaxerxes, the kings of Persia. The temple was completed on March 12 during the 6th year of King Darius' reign. Yeah, they'll give the exact date down here in the footnotes. Aramaic on the 3rd day of the month of Adar of the ancient Hebrew lunar calendar. A number of events in Ezra can be cross-checked with the dates in surviving Persian records and related accurately to our modern calendar. This day was March 12, 515 BC. All right. The temple of God was then dedicated with great joy by the people of Israel, the priests, the Levites, and the rest of the people who had returned from exile. During the dedication ceremony for the temple of God, 100 young bulls, 200 rams, and 400 male lambs were sacrificed, and 12 male goats were presented as a sin offering for the 12 tribes of Israel. Then the priests and Levites were divided into their various divisions to serve at the temple of God in Jerusalem as prescribed in the book of Moses. On April 21, again based on Persian calendar and linkings, we know when it was, the returned exiles celebrated Passover. The priests and Levites had purified themselves and were ceremonially clean. So they slaughtered the Passover lamb for all returned exiles, for their fellow priests, and for themselves. The Passover meal was eaten by the people of Israel who had returned from exile, and by the others in the land who had turned from their corrupt practices to worship Yahweh, the God of Israel. Then they celebrated the festival of unleavened bread for 7 days. There was great joy throughout the land because Yahweh had caused the king of Assyria, Persia actually, to be favorable to them, so that he helped them rebuild the temple of God, the God of Israel. Footnote F. King Darius of Persia is here identified as the king of Assyria because Persia had conquered the Babylonian Empire, which included the earlier Assyrian Empire. All right. Interesting explanation. So that's chapter 6, and we have time to go on to chapter 7. I'm trying to get quickly through Ezra. I mean, the story's kind of interesting, but anyway, here's the part of Ezra we kind of want to get to. Many years later, during the reign of King Artaxerxes of Persia, there was a man named Ezra. He was the son of Sariah, son of Azariah, son of Hilkiah, son of Shallum, son of Zadok, son of Ahitub, son of Amariah, son of Azariah, son of Moriah, son of Zerahiah, son of Uzi, son of Buki, son of Abishua, son of Phinehas, son of Eleazar, son of Aaron, the high priest. That's probably not inclusive of all generations, but Ezra does trace his lineage back to Aaron, the high priest. So he was an eligible priest in the line of Aaron. This Ezra was a scribe who was well versed in the law of Moses, which the Lord, the God of Israel, had given to the people of Israel. He came up to Jerusalem from Babylon, and the king gave him everything he asked for, because the gracious hand of the Lord his God was on him. Some of the people of Israel, as well as some of the priests, Levites, singers, gatekeepers, and temple servants, traveled up to Jerusalem with him in the 7th year of King Artaxerxes' reign. Ezra arrived in Jerusalem in August of that year. He had arranged to leave Babylon on April 8, the first day of the new year, and he arrived at Jerusalem on August 4, for the gracious hand of his God was on him. So you've got, let's see, April, May, June, July, August. You've got 4 or 5 months there that it took to travel from Babylon to Jerusalem. This was because Ezra had determined to study and obey the law of the Lord and to teach those decrees and regulations to the people of Israel. Interpretation. Could it be he was a control addict and he'd read all this stuff and thought, we got to get the people to do this, so God will bless them, blah, blah, blah. Well, at any rate, let's read and see what he says about himself. King Artaxerxes had given a copy of the following letter to Ezra, the priest and scribe who studied and taught the commands and decrees of the Lord to Israel. From Artaxerxes, the king of kings, to Ezra, the priest, the teacher of the law of the God of heaven, greetings. I decree that any of the people of Israel in my kingdom, including the priests and Levites, may volunteer to return to Jerusalem with you. I and my council of 7 hereby instruct you to conduct an inquiry into the situation in Judah and Jerusalem based on your God's law, which is in your hand. We also commission you to take with you silver and gold, which we are freely presenting as an offering to the God of Israel who lives in Jerusalem. Furthermore, you are to take any silver and gold that you may obtain from the province of Babylon, as well as the voluntary offerings of the people and the priests that are presented for the temple of their God in Jerusalem. So essentially, to the Jews that remained in Babylon and did not go back, they were given the opportunity to make free will offerings toward the temple, and apparently some of them did so. These donations are to be used specifically for the purchase of bulls, rams, male lambs, and the appropriate grain offerings and liquid offerings, all of which will be offered on the altar of the temple of your God in Jerusalem. Any silver and gold that is left over may be used in whatever way you and your colleagues feel is the will of your God. But as for the cups we are entrusting to you for the service of the temple of your God, deliver them all to the God of Jerusalem. If you need anything else for your God's temple or for any similar needs, you may take it from the royal treasury. I, Artaxerxes the king, hereby send this decree to all the treasurers in the province west of the Euphrates River. You are to give Ezra, the priest and teacher of the law, the God of heaven, whatever he requests of you. You are to give him up to 7,500 pounds of silver, 500 bushels of wheat, 550 gallons of wine, 550 gallons of olive oil, and an unlimited supply of salt. Be careful to provide whatever the God of heaven demands for his temple. For why should we risk bringing God's anger against the realm of the king and his sons? I also decree that no priest, Levite, singer, gatekeeper, temple servant, or other worker in this temple of God will be required to pay tribute, customs, or tolls of any kind. Reflecting tax-free status granted to religious organizations in our country. And you, Ezra, are to use the wisdom your God has given you to appoint magistrates and judges who know your God's laws to govern all the people in the province west of the Euphrates River. Teach the law to anyone who does not know it. Anyone who refuses to obey the law of your God and the law of the king will be punished immediately, either by death, banishment, confiscation of goods, or imprisonment. Now, just another word about that. I just mentioned the tax-exempt status given to religious organizations. It sounds like a good thing. It sounds kind of like a separation of church and state, because now the government is not imposing a financial burden on religious organizations by taxing them. It was decided very early on in the history of our country that the power to tax was also the power to destroy. And it is how local governments got tax exempt status. They didn't have to pay federal taxes on their municipal operations, because then if the federal government didn't like a local government, they could tax it to death. The power to tax, the power to destroy. And for that reason then, tax exemption was extended to religious organizations. But that creates a problem, because now the government, which has an interest in collecting revenue in order to keep itself operational, I mean, it has to have money to, well, yeah, sometimes the government just make up money. It borrows money and spends that instead of spending its own money and taxing. But, the idea is the government needs money to operate, and it gets that money through taxes. Well, now it's granting a tax exemption to religions. So in order to not have everybody declare themselves a religion and all exempt themselves from taxes, the government now has to be in the business of deciding what is and what is not a legitimate religious organization. I think that's a problem. It's not a big problem. I mean, for the most part, common sense has reigned, and we haven't seen any really ridiculous rulings for the most part. But there's that potential. And if you give the government the right to decide what is and is not legitimate religion, are you not recombining church and state in a way that you probably shouldn't? Just a note. Anyway. Conclusion of this chapter. Praise the Lord, the God of our ancestors, who made the king want to beautify the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem, and praise him for demonstrating such unfailing love to me by honoring me before the king, his council, and all his mighty nobles. I felt encouraged because the gracious hand of the Lord my God was on me, and I gathered some of the leaders of Israel to return with me to Jerusalem. Here's a list of the family leaders and the genealogies of those who came with me from Babylon during the reign of King Artaxerxes. And I'm just going to kind of skip over all this, a bunch of names and numbers and so forth. I assembled the exiles at the Ahava Canal, and we camped there for 3 days while I went over the lists of the people and the priests who had arrived. I found that not one Levite had volunteered to come along, so I sent for Eleazar, Ariel, Shemaiah, Elnathan, Jerub, Elnathan, Nathan, Zechariah, and Meshullam, who were leaders of the people. I also sent for Joiarib and Elnathan, who were men of discernment. I sent to Iddo, the leader of the Levites at Casiphia, to ask him and his relatives and the temple servants to send us ministers for the temple of God at Jerusalem. Since the gracious hand of our God was on us, they sent us a man named Sherebiah, along with 18 of his sons and brothers. He was a very astute man and a descendant of Mali, who was a descendant of Levi, son of Israel. They also sent Hashabiah, together with Josiah from the descendants of Merari, and 20 of his sons and brothers, and 220 temple servants. The temple servants were assistants to the Levites, a group of temple workers first instituted by King David and his officials. They were all listed by name. And there by the Ahava Canal I gave orders for all of us to fast and humble ourselves before our God. We prayed that he would give us a safe journey and protect us, our children, and our goods as we traveled. For I was ashamed to ask the king for soldiers and horsemen to accompany us and protect us from enemies along the way. After all, we had told the king, our God's hand of protection is on all who worship him, but his fierce anger rages against those who abandon him. Old covenant thinking expressed here. So we fasted and earnestly prayed that our God would take care of us, and he heard our prayer. I appointed 12 leaders of the priests, Sherebiah, Hashabiah, and 10 other priests, to be in charge of transporting the silver, the gold bowls, and the other items that the king, his council, his officials, and all the people of Israel had presented for the temple of God. I weighed the treasure as I gave it to them and found the total to be as follows: 24 tons of silver, 7,500 pounds of silver articles, 7,500 pounds of gold, 20 gold bowls equal in value to 1,000 gold coins, 2 fine articles of polished bronze as precious as gold. And I said to these priests, you and these treasures have been set apart as holy to the Lord. The silver and gold is a voluntary offering to the Lord, the God of our ancestors. Guard these treasures well until you present them to the leading priests, the Levites, and the leaders of Israel, who will weigh them at the storerooms of the Lord's temple in Jerusalem. So the priests and the Levites accepted the task of transporting these treasures of silver and gold to the temple of our God in Jerusalem. We broke camp at the Ahava Canal on April 19 and started off to Jerusalem. And the gracious hand of our God protected us and saved us from enemies and bandits along the way. So we arrived safely in Jerusalem, where we rested for 3 days. On the 4th day after our arrival, the silver, gold, and other valuables were weighed at the temple of our God and entrusted to Meremoth, son of Uriah the priest, and to Eleazar, son of Phinehas, along with Jozabad, son of Yeshua, and Noadiah, son of Benui, both of whom were Levites. Everything was accounted for by number and weight, and the total weight was officially recorded. So in other words, he weighed it when they left, and he weighed it when they got there to make sure that nobody snuck off with anything. It was ancient type of bookkeeping. You don't trust people, so you verify. Trust but verify, Then the exiles who had come out of captivity sacrificed burnt offerings to the God of Israel. They presented 12 bulls for all the people of Israel, as well as 96 rams and 77 male lambs. They also offered 12 male goats as a sin offering. All this was given as a burnt offering to the Lord. The king's decrees were delivered to his highest officers and the governors of the province west of the Euphrates River, who then cooperated by supporting the people from the temple and the temple of God. Now, as you can see from the subtitle there, we get to the interesting part. When these things had been done, the Jewish leaders came to me and said, many of the people of Israel, and even some of the priests and Levites, have not kept themselves separate from other peoples living in the land. They have taken up the detestable practices of the Canaanites, Hittites, Perizzites, Jebusites, Ammonites, Moabites, Egyptians, and Amorites. Now, whether they actually did this or whether it was an assumption made based on what they're about to say, I couldn't say for sure. For the men of Israel have married women from these people and have taken them as wives for their sons. So the holy race has become polluted by these mixed marriages. Worse yet, the leaders and officials have led the way in his outrage. Marrying foreign women in the past had been a problem. It was a problem for Solomon, as I think will be mentioned here. But David also had foreign wives, and in David's line was Solomon, who married Rahab the harlot, and then Boaz, who married Ruth the Moabitess. So just because you married a foreign woman didn't make it a problem. And the accusation that's brought to Ezra is that they're doing these practices, but they're not providing evidence that these things were happening. My wife's hollering at me. I'm going to have to go see what she wants. What's that? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. She wanted me to point out the provision that the Israelites were allowed to marry foreign women who were virgins after they took a city. Now that was not from the people of the land, it was other people, but they were allowed to. So yeah, that was allowed in earlier times, but now these people are making a big deal about it. And there's some language here that's very key to help us understand what's going on here in verse 2. So the holy race has become polluted by these mixed marriages. Well, what does that term holy race say? It says we're better than those other people. And when you marry those other people, you pollute our race because we're better than them. You shouldn't do that. You should keep us pure and better than everybody else. That is what's behind what's going on here and what Ezra is confronting with these foreign marriages. Now, I'm not going to say that none of these foreign marriages caused problems, because they probably did. Ahab married Jezebel and led the people of Israel far astray. I mean, these things do happen. But to make it a blanket statement and to go to the extreme of saying, hey, we're better than these other people, and if you marry them, you pollute the holy race, that's some serious arrogance going on. And it denies the fundamental equality of all humans before their Creator. God didn't create just the Hebrews and everybody else just happened to be there and they're not God's people. No, they're all God's people. He made them all. Anyway, Ezra says, when I heard this, I tore my cloak and my shirt, pulled hair from my head and beard, and sat down utterly shocked. Then all who trembled at the words of the God of Israel came and sat with me because of this outrage committed by the returned exiles. And I sat there utterly appalled until the time of the evening sacrifice. At the time of the sacrifice, I stood up from where I had sat in mourning with my clothes torn. I fell to my knees and lifted my hands to the Lord my God. I prayed, "Oh my God, I am utterly ashamed. I blush to lift up my face to you, for our sins are piled higher than our heads, and our guilt has reached to the heavens. From the days of our ancestors until now, we have been steeped in sin." Well, yeah, you're human. You're born in sin. You're steeped in sin. That's the nature of the human race. Only God can get you out. What you try to do now isn't going to get you out of sin. It's just going to create problems. That is why we and our kings and our priests have been at the mercy of the pagan kings of the land. We've been killed, captured, robbed, and disgraced, just as we are today. But now we've been given a brief moment of grace, for the Lord our God has allowed a few of us to survive as a remnant. He has given us security in this holy place. Our God has brightened our eyes and granted us some relief from our slavery. For we were slaves, but in his unfailing love our God did not abandon us in our slavery. Instead, he caused the kings of Persia to treat us favorably. He revived us so we could rebuild the temple of our God and repair its ruins. He has given us a protective wall in Judah and Jerusalem. Now this is interesting. Notice he says here in verse 9, "For we were slaves. God did not abandon us in our slavery." What did the Jews say in Jesus' day? "We're Jews. We've never been slaves of anyone." Short memories indeed. Yeah. Anyway. "And now, O our God, what can we say after all of this? For once again we have abandoned your commands. Your servants, the prophets, warned us when they said, 'The land you are entering to possess is totally defiled by the detestable practices of the people living there. From one end to the other, the land is filled with corruption. Don't let your daughters marry their sons. Don't take their daughters as wives your sons.'" Yes, that was said, by the way. "Don't ever promote the peace and prosperity of those nations. If you follow these instructions, you will be strong and will enjoy the good things the land produces, and you will leave this prosperity to your children forever. Now we are being punished because of our wickedness and our great guilt. But we have actually been punished far less than we deserve, for you, our God, have allowed some of us to survive as a remnant. But even so, we are again breaking your commands and intermarrying with people who do these detestable things. Won't your anger be enough to destroy us, so that even this little remnant no longer survives? O Lord God of Israel, you are just. We come before you, and our guilt is nothing but an escaped remnant, though in such a condition none of us can stand in your presence. While Ezra prayed and made this confession, weeping and lying face down on the ground in front of the temple of God, a very large crowd of people from Israel, men, women, and children, gathered and wept bitterly with him. Then Shechaniah, son of Jehiel, a descendant of Elam, said to Ezra, "We have been unfaithful to our God, for we have married these pagan women of the land. But in spite of this, there is hope for Israel. Let us now make a covenant with our God to divorce our pagan wives and send them away with their children. We will follow the advice given by you and by the others who respect the commands of our God. Let it be done according to the law of God. Get up, for it is your duty to tell us how to proceed in setting things straight. We are behind you, so be strong and take action." So Ezra stood up and demanded that the leaders of the priests and Levites and all the people of Israel swear that they would do as Shechaniah had said. And they all swore a solemn oath. Then Ezra left the front of the temple of God and went to the room of Johanan, the son of Eliashib. He spent the night there without eating or drinking anything. He was still in mourning because of the unfaithfulness of the returning exiles. I'm reading quickly because I want to get through this because we're near the end of our time. Then a proclamation was made throughout Judah and Jerusalem that all the exiles should come to Jerusalem. Those who failed to come within 3 days would, if the leaders and elders so decided, forfeit all their property and be expelled from the assembly of the exiles. Within 3 days, all the people of Judah and Benjamin had gathered in Jerusalem. This took place on December 19, and all the people were sitting in the square before the temple of God. They were trembling, both because of the seriousness of the matter and because it was raining. Raining in December, not a fun thing. I can tell you about raining in December. Maybe I will sometime. Then Ezra the priest stood and said to them, "You have committed a terrible sin. By marrying pagan women, you have increased Israel's guilt. So now confess your sin to the Lord, the God of your ancestors, and do what he demands. Separate yourselves from the people of the land and from these pagan women." Then the whole assembly raised their voices and answered, "Yes, you are right. We must do as you say." Then they added, "This isn't something that can be done in a day or two, for many of us are involved in this extremely sinful affair. And this is the rainy season, so we cannot stay out here much longer. Let our leaders act on behalf of us all. Let everyone who has a pagan wife come at a scheduled time, accompanied by the leaders and judges of his city, so that the fierce anger of our God concerning this affair may be turned away from us." Only Jonathan, son of Asahel, and Josiah, son of Tikvah, opposed this course of action, and they were supported by Meshullam and Shabbathai the Levite. So this was the plan they followed. Ezra selected leaders to represent the families, designating each of the representatives by name. On December 29, the leaders sat down to investigate the matter. By March 27, the first day of the new year, they had finished dealing with all the men who had married pagan wives. And then it lists all the people guilty of intermarriage. And we're not going to read all of that. So, it doesn't tell us how many, but you look at that list of names, there were a lot of women with their children sent away, abandoned. And recall that in the world of that time, the women were likely to be considered contaminated because they'd already been married, they already had kids, they weren't virgins anymore, obviously. And so no other man would have them. Women did not have rights in those days, so few of them could get jobs. The only jobs they could get were as slaves or prostitutes. And so these men who are playing better than you and pushing out these women for no other reason than they aren't Israelites, are essentially guilty of all the sins these women ended up having to commit in order to survive and to protect their children to the extent that they could after they were put out. And there will people who will try to tell you that Ezra and Nehemiah were model reformers. Well, I can tell you this. If Ezra and Nehemiah were model reformers, then you can expect the result of what, you can look at the result of what they did. Because in a sense, Ezra and Nehemiah were the original Pharisees. This hyper focus on the written rules from the books of Moses, and this emphasis on racial purity and moral purity, to the extent that when Jesus came and welcomed anyone who would come, they couldn't stand him, and they arranged for his execution. This is the kind of reform that leads to deicide. I know that's a harsh statement, but I think you need to read the books, you need to read the history, you need to see what the results were and make a conclusion on the validity of the Reformation based on the results of the Reformation. At any rate, how many more chapters are there? There aren't any more. So I didn't expect to do that, but we did in fact finish the book of Ezra. We're ready for the book of Nehemiah, and that's a very good place, both in terms of the time and where we are in the reading, for us to quit. So thanks for joining us. We'll pick up with the book of Nehemiah next week. Since it'll be 4 weeks next week, you can probably also count on a sermon presentation on the following Saturday, which will be the 13th. I didn't say so at the beginning. This is Friday, September 5th, 2025. Of course, you probably already knew that anyway, but if I say it, then it's part of the recording and the record, so it can be placed later exactly when we did this. So thank you for joining us. We invite you to join us again next week as we continue and get into the book of Nehemiah. And until then, we say goodbye and God bless.